Welcome to the world of Kenshi, where you could be a human guy, a weird human guy, a robot, or a stick bug. Do you like pointing at a guy in shackles and saying to the salesman, "I'll take that one, please"? Do you like small cages and wish that you could spend more time in one? Then Kenshi is the place for you. The first time I played this game, I started as a man without an arm in the middle of the desert, and the first group of people I ran into proceeded to beat my cheeks at 3 times speed, pick me up, and force me into involuntary labor. Before I even knew what was going on, I was already hitting rocks with a pickaxe. Kenshi is not f***ing around. I suspect that there's many people out there who tried to play Kenshi, tried to get into it, and just bounced right off of it. I suspect even more people boot up Kenshi and they look at this screen, their eyes glaze over, and they ask out loud to an empty room, "What the f*** am I supposed to do?" Kenshi is the confused old man meme in video game form. What's the story? Well, that's up to you. What do you do in a game? Again, that's up to you. What's the goal? I said that's up to you! Kenshi is wide open. It gives you tools. You use those tools in whatever way you see fit. You set goals for yourself, and when you accomplish those goals, you do something else for a little while. It's aimless, and sometimes that's intimidating, but that's what I'm here for. I'm here to take away the anxiety and show you how to actually Kenshi. Alright, I have a public service announcement. I have gotten into Warhammer. Yes, I know, I've already warned my family. As such, I need your money, because I chose to play the Tau and I'm looking at future bankruptcy. So, if you like this content and want more of it, support me on Patreon. Also, I get joy when line goes up, so subscribe. Okay, bye. Before we create our character, we need to have a gander at the difficulty settings. Default difficulty is 1, and you can increase the difficulty in a lot of different ways that will actually change the state of the world. For instance, there's this slider here. This is a naughty little slider because it increases the size of groups of bandits, which means that their groups will be so big that chances are they'll overwhelm the guards in town, which means there is no escape from the fun. So, if you're looking to have a session where the entire world is at war and you want a real survival challenge, play with all the sliders turned up to max. I did it once and it was unique. Kenshi is a harsh game that takes place in a harsh world. And speaking of the world, it hates you. It has a family feud with you that spans generations, and it's looking to end the drama once and for all. To survive, we need to beat Kenshi at its own game. And you might think the best way to do that is to start the game with a broken build and just exploit the shoddy systems, to run over the game with our car and drive off, letting the secret of that terrible night die with you and the hooker in your passenger seat. And if you thought that, you would be wrong. You would be wrong. See, Kenshi is a special kind of game. Special like when my cat runs full speed into the sliding glass doors for the 15th time this week. When you start a new game, you don't just start as a guy in a world where his life could go either way. In Kenshi, you are the bottom of the barrel. You are pond scum. You are the bacteria that other bacteria eats in order to aid in the digestion of other bacteria that it ate. Your life is a wide, deep hole, and you are at the bottom of it. Playing this game for the first time can be like staring up at the edge of that hole, wondering if there's anything else to the world besides this hole. And then one day you get good enough at the game to climb out, and you find out that there is something more to this world than just your hole. But unfortunately, it's just other holes. You have to work your way up in a world that wants you dead. Every animal in the desert wants to eat you. Hell, even some of the people want to eat you. There are several starting points, and some of them are easier than others. So for instance, you could start as a trader. You get some cash, you get trade goods, and a beast of burden to start, and that is one of the easier playthroughs. If you're intimidated easily, then this is probably the route that you want to start on. But I find that the more challenging a playthrough is, the more fun I end up having, because difficulty in Kenshi can be annoying. especially if you save scum. But if you're forced to live with the consequences of what you do, you tend to act a little more carefully, and a story starts to emerge. The story of your character. And when you're faced with these sort of impossible odds, you start to come up with some really clever ways to get around problems. So we don't need easy. Pick an origin, any will do, but try to pick something that inspires a story for your character. Like, sure, my guy's a trader, but where did he get all that money to buy the mule? Where did he buy the luxury goods? How long has he been carrying this stuff around, unable to sell it for? When you have a backstory for your character, it's easy to then determine what the character's goals should be, because we are, all of us, defined by our past in some way. And you need a goal in Kenshi to get the most out of your game. You don't need to start with a goal, but let's say that you take the trader character and you don't have a goal. And instead of making it to the next town, you get ambushed by cannibals who proceed to eat your pack mule. You survived, but now what? What does your character do in response? Does he plan an elaborate raid, work until he builds an army, and visit sweet revenge on the savage people of Kenshi? Sometimes the game writes its own story, but it's always good to have goals to work towards. Character creation's pretty easy. You pick a race, a sub-race, a gender, and start sliding stuff around. In order to maximize our experience with Kenshi, we need to pick the best race in the game, and by the best, I mean the one that everyone hates the most. Bugmen. Now, bugmen, or hivers as they like to be called, have some interesting sub-races and a lot in common with ants. And if you know anything about ants, you know that ants are pretty badass. Like, you can be a scorpion if you want, but an ant still kicks your ass because he's got a couple hundred friends he's bringing to the fight. You've got 3 sub-races, you have a worker drone, and these guys are good at, you guessed it, work. They love to work. You can tell by these racial stats over here. This 20% bonus means that his skill levels up 20% faster, and anything with a penalty levels up slower. He's also got decent hit points, but the soldier sub-race, he sucks at everything, except fighting. He's pretty good at that, but holy hell, look at them hit points. Yes, my man is a beefcake. He can tank a lot of hits, and being able to take more hits is important in a game like Kenshi, and that's why we're taking the Prince, the worst subclass in the game. Why, Strat? Why are you doing this? Because this game is easy when you do what I do. And we don't need stats when we have a cool-ass bugman with a long neck. I mean super long! Look at that neck! He's the throat goat!
Look at this dude.
Next, we name your character. Now, you need something that's gonna strike fear into the hearts of men, like Batman or Scarecrow, or, hear me out, Snooty. Now, you'll tell people your name, and they'll look at you and think, why is his name Snooty? He doesn't even have a nose. I'm confused and scared. And that's exactly how we want him. Not all creatures are created equal, at least not in the world of Kenshi. You see, we've got this situation in Kenshi where if you happen to be a big-eyed stick bug, some people are gonna hate you. And they may even try to kill you. But this isn't a story about death. This is a story about a hive prince named Snooty who's about to find out that there are things much worse than death awaiting him in the desert. The scene opens up in a bar in the UC. That's the United Cities for the uninitiated, a society of sorts. In the UC, you're either a samurai or you're not. Snooty was in fact not. The former prince was nothing at the moment, nothing but another drunk drinking away memories, but for a hiver, forgetting their home was not that easy. He found himself there in the bar, down to the last jingle jangles in his pocket without a purpose. Used to be that he had one, to serve the hive, but without a community to go home to, he's a penknife with a dull edge and no ink, unable to serve the purpose that he was designed for. In another corner, we have a lady who had nothing ladylike in her demeanor. She was a redwood among Christmas trees, a 7-foot-tall, broad-shouldered, muscled beast of a woman that even the largest lesbians were too afraid to hit on. These two unlikely friends are about to become the closest allies that one another has, even though neither of them knows it yet. But let's not talk about that, because Snooty got a visitor. Just as he was about to go curl up in a dark corner somewhere and sleep it off, a beautiful woman with a body that could kill a heart patient walked up and squeezed in next to him, and for some reason, the men all moved away. Now, Snooty didn't think anything of it. Humans all look alike to him, with those ridiculous things hanging from the middle of their faces and the equally ridiculous things hanging between their legs. He barely registered the woman when she sat down, but there was something he did notice about her. She had the biggest pair of milk sacks that he'd ever seen, and while it's true he hadn't seen many, that's what made them so fascinating. It was really about the mystery of it all, because they were keeping it secret by putting clothes on. So what did these things look like? Where does the milk come from? Is there like a little spigot that you could turn on and off? What's the deal with these things? Wanting to get right to the point, Snooty popped the question. Hey, can I see them things? And she was more than happy to oblige. In fact, she led him by hand down the streets to a dark alleyway where she could show him her goods. Snooty stood there in anticipation, waiting as her shirt slowly crept up her torso, and as those sacks hung there, suspended by only the bottom of her shirt, the mystery grew. But then, everything went black. In the darkness, there was no feeling, no dreams of the hive. The ambient sounds of the town had been shut out like someone pulled the cord on a radio. There was nothing but a dull pain throbbing in the back of his skull, slowly intensifying as he regained feeling in his exoskeleton. Something was shaking him, yelling, calling him a bug, slapping him about the face, and when his eyes opened, it was then that he realized he was in chains, his hands bound to the legs of a rather tall and burly-looking woman. Apparently, after the woman from the bar caught Snooty in her honeypot, she set up the same lure for the gorilla-sized woman in front of him. She said her name was Silverback. For days, they carried Snooty through the desert until they finally came to a canyon pass, and nestled within the valley was a quarry for mining. And who do you think they had out there mining?
Is it a human child? I wish!
It was a bunch of sheks, hivers, and women. All of them chained up, everyone so skinny that you could count their ribs. They were the envy of teenage girls everywhere. And it's here that the realization finally set in, when they handed him an orange jumpsuit and a pickaxe. He was truly no longer a hiver prince, and he was now instead a slave. Because princes don't work, and these guys, this so-called holy nation, not only did they not pay their employees, but they also forced them to work. I mean, imagine the indignity of a prince made to work like a peasant. Snooty came to hate the holy nation almost immediately. If he had to do anything that wasn't beating on a rock or running to a rock to proceed to beat on it, the guards would attack him and beat the hell out of him and throw him in a cage so small he couldn't lie down in it. And for dinner, he ate some kind of mush that was technically food, but it was on the borderline. No matter how much of the slop he ate, it never filled him up. He was always left with a hunger that never went away, and because he was hungry, every attempt he made to escape the slave pit was destined for failure. His escape attempts always ended the same way: a beating, jailing, healing, coma, and work the next day, because slaves don't get sick days. If he tried to beat up the guards, he'd get knocked out before he could even mount a defense, or an offense, or even get a single hit off. This was a problem because of the way Kenshi handles leveling your character. Let me explain. Have you played Morrowind, Oblivion, or Skyrim? If no, then how did you find me? If yes, then congratulations, you know how the skill system in Kenshi works. You have skills. The more you use those skills, the more those skills level up. The higher the level of a skill, the better you are at that skill. It's all rather straightforward, but there are some nuances that we need to cover for you to get the most out of your leveling experience. Now, see how in this footage, Snooty is trying to break himself off a piece of this guard? Why? Why would he even try to attack anyone at his level? He can't possibly beat him. Well, that's because in Kenshi, there are only a few ways to level up your combat skills, and that's unfortunately just by beating people about the faces and various body parts. But since our hands are shackled and we're starving to death, we can't really do much aside from look at the enemy menacingly. To start this section, let's talk about the biggest, most important stat in the game, and that's hit points. You have a certain amount of them, depending on the race and sub-race you pick, and that is all you're ever gonna get. Each limb has the same amount of HP, and if that HP reaches 0, that limb is crippled, or, worst case scenario, the limb is lopped off. Yes, you can permanently lose a limb in this game, and you probably will. Each limb has an effect on your effectiveness in doing any number of things. For example, if your legs are crippled, this will greatly affect your ability to run, because you won't be running, you'll be laying on your stomach crawling everywhere. Each thing you do in this game has an effect on how good you are at other things. For instance, wearing armor can decrease your ability to dodge incoming attacks, or even swing your weapon effectively. The same is true for wearing a backpack, for instance. Some backpacks decrease your fighting ability and your stealth, because how are you going to sneak around with a Morocco on your back? Hunger, for example, will give you all kinds of stat debuffs, and if you get too hungry, you'll just start randomly taking naps. And if you get even more hungrier than that, you'll just give up on life. Whenever your hunger stat drops below 250, your character will eat whatever food in your inventory has the lowest nutritional value, which keeps your characters from eating something expensive that you intended to sell. Each race has a different rate at which they get hungry as well. Humans are the baseline. They get hungry at 1 times the rate, while hivers get hungry at half that rate, and honestly, that's kind of their superpower. And Sheks get hungry 1 to 2 times faster than humans. Yet another reason why bugmen are the best men. Then there's bleeding. You bleed, oddly enough, when you get cut. You get cut when some desert hole swings a sword at you and it hits you. You'll keep bleeding until it's bandaged, and you can't bandage a wound without med kits or the equivalent for your race if you're a robot. Any damage you take that decreases your HP can only be increased by resting in a bed or by waiting a really long time. Ability scores are where things get interesting. Just like a Bethesda RPG, your ability scores go up as long as you do certain things more, but unlike, say, Oblivion, you don't increase the ability score through using your skills, you increase them by doing very specific things. There are 4 ability scores: Dexterity, Perception, Strength, and Toughness. Dexterity increases whenever you hit someone with a light weapon. That means each time you hit, you gain a flat amount of experience. Dexterity increases your attack speed and block speed with all weapons except unarmed. Slashing damage does more damage, and you'll reload ranged weapons faster. I'm also fairly positive it reduces the damage that animals cut and pierce damage does, but I can't be sure. Perception increases when you hit someone using a ranged weapon or turret. Perception only affects your ability to hit with ranged weapons. It increases your ability to hit reliably and to hit someone from further away. You don't want to sleep on crossbows. They absolutely shred enemy health, especially in the early game, but friendly fire is turned on, so be careful not to accidentally shoot a friend. Now, strength is increased by running around with a heavy load, meaning moving around while encumbered and by using a heavier weapon in combat. Strength will increase the amount of damage you do with blunt weapons, hackers, and unarmed combat. It also increases the amount of stuff you can carry comfortably. Toughness is raised by getting hit. and getting up from the ground instead of playing dead. With a high toughness, we get more damage resistance, our wounds get worse slower, and our knockout point is lower, which means we become a much tougher opponent to knock out or kill. So why am I trying to hit this guy? Because I need all the practice I can get, because half of my ability scores require that I beat on someone to use them. And problem is, our strength is reduced by our hunger by 90%. And because our martial arts skill is at 0 and our hands are shackled, not only are we not finding an opening to attack, but when we do attack, we do hardly any damage. At this rate, we'll never level up. There are ways to game the system, however. For instance, if I wanted to train strength, I could fill my backpack with a bunch of crap, then just have Snooty run around camp, leveling up his strength as he works, and while he's working, and there's no guards around, if you click on an empty space to move Snooty, he'll walk clear across the camp looking for another job to do. It's a great way to train strength. In fact, if you put the game on 3 times speed, go take a have a snack, talk to your significant other, have another snack, take a shower, come back, you'll be at high strength with hardly any effort on your part. If you want to increase it even faster, pick up a dead body and start carrying it around like a sandbag, and you'll double the rate at which you gain strength. But for the rest of these stats, the only way to increase them is to fight. But in Kenshi, you start out as a weakling, unskilled and bony of build. In other words, you can't fight for shit. So we do what any loser who can't fight does, but still wants to appear like a tough guy. We get our friends involved. As for skills, I'll go over them real quick, but I won't go into too much depth because it's all rather straightforward. Let's talk about the important skills, the combat skills. First, athletics. The higher this skill, the faster you run. This is one of the most important skills that we have because in the early game, we'll be doing a lot of running away from things. And once we get a weapon, we'll be using a hit and run technique to help us get through the fights that we have no business winning. You raise athletics by running around with a light inventory, but the XP gained is reduced when we have a heavy load. But the benefit to a heavy load is that we are increasing 2 stats at the same time, athletics and strength. Melee attack skill increases your ability to hit, reduces the enemy's chance to dodge or block, and your attack speed. Melee defense determines your chance to block an incoming attack. Then you have the more indirect approach. The assassination skill, which is the best combat skill in the game, you're wrong if you say it ain't, is used to knock out people while in stealth. And speaking of stealth, let's talk about that, shall we? Stealth is not just for sneaking. Sure, it can be used to sneak into a place you aren't wanted or used to steal something off a shopkeeper's shelves, but it also affects your ability to disguise yourself as a faction without getting caught. This will be very important when trying to escape the bounty hunters that come looking for escaped slaves. But I think that's enough about skills. I think you get the point. They do what they say they do, and they level up by using them. The best way to learn the game is to play the game. So, let's get back to Snooty and see how he's doing. Snooty, after many attempts to kill a guard, even with help from other slaves, couldn't even get close to knocking one out because no matter how hard he tried, he still couldn't raise his martial arts or his attack skill in order to actually get off an attack. Your attack skill needs to be higher than 0. He had a catch-22 situation here. Damned if you don't, damned if you do scenario. He couldn't fight the guards without training, and he couldn't train without fighting the guards. But combat wasn't the only way to get better at weapons. In the tower, where all the guards sleep, was a second floor, and on that second floor was a set of training dummies. The best part was, the guards never went up to the second floor. So, if Snooty could get up those stairs without being seen, he'd have a way to train without taking the risk of bodily harm. The only problem was, how was he going to sneak in there? His exoskeleton creaked when he walked like an old screen door, and he had pegs for legs. And do you know what those sound like on wooden floors? He needed to train up on stealth, but at this level, if he tried to sneak anywhere, the guards would find him and punish him. And that's when he got a brilliant idea. sometimes the guards would put Snooty into a cage on the second floor of a building in camp. When that happened, Snooty would break out of the cage, which would train his lockpicking, and while he was out of his cage, he'd walk around in a circle the entire night, training up his stealth skill. But Strat, you're probably saying, how can you train sneak without a guard around? Technically, there is a guard just below me. And because he's just below us and sleeping, we can train sneak without waking him up and getting attacked. Little did Snooty know, but Silverback was on the other side of the camp doing the exact same thing, except she was taking things just a step further. At night, she let out the other prisoners out of their cages, and before they could run away, she'd sneak up behind them and knock them out. She did this in the broad daylight too. Anytime she got left alone with a slave, and there were no guards in sight, she'd sneak up behind him and whack him over the head. Every time she succeeded, her assassination skill went up. And because the enemy was knocked out, she could steal their gear or pick up their unconscious body and use it as a training weight. Silverback discovered another neat trick. If she took off her shackles at night and put them in her inventory, the guards would come and put another pair on her while she slept and not take the old ones out of her inventory. This was a good way to load up on weight since each shackle weighed 20 kilos. If she kept her encumbrance level over 75%, her strength increased even further. So, to maximize her training, she'd break out of her cell, knock out all the slaves, take their shackles, and sneak around the roof until it was time to work the next day. And with all the extra weight in her bag, her strength shot up considerably. And because she kept knocking people out, her assassination skill was getting pretty respectable. Not yet high enough to knock out a guard, but that would be coming soon. Days passed with Silverback and Snooty doing the same routine, and when they'd get locked up in the cells together, they'd exchange notes and make plans. Snooty had his goals, and she had hers, and soon, if they kept up their training, they'd get out of that camp and be free. But there was one more obstacle: toughness. Now, neither of them, despite their appearances, were all that tough, and when your toughness is at 0, you suffer 60% more damage from attacks, which means that 1 or 2 hits to the noggin and it's lights out for either of them. So, by night, they trained their calisthenics, and by day, they picked fights with the guards just so they could raise their toughness. Weeks passed and progress was slow. One night, Snooty made a decision. He was going to try to break into that tower. If he failed, it'd just be another night tied to a pole. If he succeeded, then he'd be one more step to his goal of being free. The issue was the place was being guarded, and there was only one way into the place. So Snooty hid in the shadows and waited until the door was clear and made straight for the tower. With the place being empty, it was easy to get up the stairs and begin training. Days went by and Snooty smacked that dummy, slowly gaining skills he would never have gained if he kept trying to fight the guards. Then he got an idea. Maybe while the guards are out beating up other slaves, he could sneak downstairs and find out what the guards are storing in all those containers. That's when he found a trove of weapons and armor, and what was even better was, Snooty found some food. He'd be a little less worse for wear in almost every department. Things were looking good, and Snooty was no longer helpless. Well, at least not as helpless as he used to be. But after days of training and relatively small amounts of progress, Snooty realized that he wasn't learning anything new, and the training dummies were no longer useful. And that cinched it. He was going to have to train the old-fashioned way by beating on guards, or, as often the case was, getting his shit pushed in by a group of guards. But then, just as Snooty was getting tougher and things seemed to be getting better, the worst thing that could have happened, happened. While fighting a guard, Snooty lost an arm. And I don't mean he misplaced it. It learned how to fly just before learning what gravity was. Snooty was in shock and in a coma for an entire day. In fact, until he woke up the next day and tried to pick the lock to his cage, he hadn't fully realized his limb was gone. But once that realization sunk in, well, so did the depression. Silverback tried to keep his spirits up, but Snooty was a defeated man. He was no longer concentrated on escaping. His mind could only focus on not dying. It was obvious to Silverback that Snooty was a lost cause. They weren't getting out of this together, and as much as she hated the idea, it looked like she was going to need to get out of this situation on her own. But the moment she tried to leave, she couldn't. She just couldn't leave that little bug man behind. So, she came up with a different plan. The situation was, she had no way of taking down a guard in a fair fight, and Snooty wouldn't survive 5 seconds in a fight with only one arm. So, Even if they were to escape together, they wouldn't make it past the gate. The only way they were getting out of this camp was to make all the guards disappear. But Silverback was only one woman, and unfortunately, not a magician. And then there was still the problem of not being able to raise her melee skills. Sure, she was tougher now and stronger, but what good is strength and toughness if you can't hit anything? So how do you get better at fighting when you are so outmatched that you can't even get a hit in, and when you do no damage? Well, you can't do it by fighting fair, I can tell you that. By now, Silverback was getting pretty good at sneaking and knocking people out. In fact, she now had a little better than a coin's toss chance at knocking a guard out. So, she snuck out of her cage at night and found where the guard, who had previously knocked off her companion's arm, was sleeping. She snuck up on him while he was snoring and deep in dreamland and knocked his ass the hell out. And since he was already asleep when this happened, he went into double sleep. Silverback stripped him naked and put on his clothes, and when that poor guard woke up, he woke up to the sight of a 7-foot-tall armored and well-armed woman holding a weapon over him. And then he proceeded to, over the span of a long fight, kick Silverback to death. No matter how much of an advantage she thought she had over the poor, defenseless guard, it wasn't enough to overcome her hunger. She spent another painful night in a cage thinking about what went wrong. Obviously, she wasn't going to be able to fight these guys while starving, and the only way she could knock out a guard was to do it with a sneak attack. But the guards would start waking up before she could knock out everyone and sneak out with Snooty. So she was going to need to make these guys disappear permanently. But how? The next day, while hitting large stones with a pickaxe, she got hit. This time, not with a guard's sword, but by inspiration. What's the difference between a free man and a slave? A pair of shackles and a cage. What if she knocked out all the guards, stripped them naked, and then locked them up in one of the cages? As long as no other guards discover her plan, she should be able to make these guards disappear one at a time. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was good enough to try. That night, she went downstairs and she knocked out the 2 guards sleeping below and threw them in a cage. While she was at it, she shackled them with the extra shackles in her inventory. And to her surprise, the very next morning, the guards were discovered by a wandering guard. Silverback sighed, just believing that another one of her plans was foiled. But to her shock, the guards didn't notice these new prisoners as their old slaver buddies, and instead, all they saw were a couple of unemployed slaves. By putting the guards in a cage, she had effectively made them no better than herself, and in the eyes of their former friends, nothing worthy of consideration, as if the act of being in a cage automatically made them lesser people. Livestock, essentially. Silverback broke out that night and started by knocking out the guards in each of the houses and stripping them naked, then throwing each one in a cell or tying them to a stake. And each day in the morning, there'd be 2 more slaves. And 2 less guards. And no one thought that there was anything wrong with that. Each day, some poor guy, let's call him Ed, wakes up and finds out he has to do more work because there wasn't enough guards to go around. And after a week, this guy, Ed, he's running the whole camp, unbeknownst to himself and all by his lonesome.
I set the building on fire.
Slowly but surely, after several late-night excursions, Silverback managed to take out every single guard that wasn't standing duty at a gate, and the slaves had the run of the entire place. After breaking the chains of every slave in the camp, some joined Silverback's crew, all but the most important slave, Snooty. He wasn't breaking out. What was the point in living without 2 pairs of hands? He'd be useless out there and probably die to a bone dog or something equally ridiculous. But sure enough, Silverback went to the front gate and made good on her promises 5 different times. With each guard down, the way was free for Snooty to make a break for it, so he did. For the first time in months, Snooty had a purpose again. His purpose was getting the hell out of there. In all the commotion, 10 slaves made it through, and only 3 made it far enough out of camp to feel safe once again. Silverback, Snooty, and a sheck named Stinks. I did not name him that, But this is where the good news ends, as the realization of their situation finally dawns on them. Freedom came with strings attached. The newly freed group was starving, literally. They had very little time to make it out of hostile territory, which is all of this, and make it here. But there was another wrinkle. They had to drop all of their gear as well, because running while encumbered was making them even more hungry, and just down this road was a ruin that had a treasure trove of good gear inside. Gear that would see the group well fed and housed, for now and until the distant future. But if they went to get that gear, they'd have starved to death before they even got out of the canyon. No, they had to make a straight line to the nearest friendly town, wherever that might be, before everyone dropped dead from hunger. Snooty and his crew made it to the canyon exit and spilled out into the open land, and the first town that they came across was another Holy Nation land, and Silverback groaned. She was fading fast, wasn't gonna be able to make it very far, and then they came to a second town, and wouldn't you know it, another Holy Nation town. At this point, the group had two choices: go to the more dangerous route in front of the town and down into the valley, brave the pools of acid and the acid rain, or go around the gate and deal with whatever horrors were down in there. Snooty decided to take the riskier route and avoid the acid pools altogether, but the acid rain was unavoidable, and the worst part was that while Snooty wasn't suffering the effects of the rain, Silverback was about to have two crippled legs. The acid was about to eat off her legs entirely. And then it happened. She was hobbling along slowly, and with these valleys teeming with malfunctioning robots, we couldn't stop to wait for her to heal up. And Snooty would have picked her up, but he can't do anything with a missing arm. So Stinks stepped up and carried that hefty woman through the valley and a ravine. On the other side of that ravine was a farmhouse. But once again, it was a Holy Nation farm, and those people shoot bugs on sight. But not only were Silverback's legs no longer working, but now she was in a coma. And when she wasn't in a coma, she was passing out cold from hunger. She was dead weight, and if Snooty didn't leave her behind, he'd probably die out there trying to save her. He looked down into the ravine to the UC desert, thinking to himself, it's only a day's walk from here. If I started running now, Stinks would either join me or allow Silverback to weigh him down. Either way, without food, Snooty was the only one who could possibly survive all this. And even though it was the smart thing to do, Snooty just couldn't bring himself to abandon her. Silverback could have given up on him and just left him to rot in that camp, but she never gave up on him, so he couldn't give up on her now. He explained the situation to Stinks, gave him a pat on the shoulder, and snuck off towards the farm. As he got closer, he realized that there was a guard up on the roof. He had a turret right next to him, ready to shoot halberd-sized harpoons through Snooty's chest, but he stayed calm. He worked his way inside, careful to be silent as possible. Luckily, Snooty was able to find food, but as soon as he picked it up, he instinctually put large chunks of it into his mouth. In fact, anything we put in his inventory was probably going to be at risk of getting eaten before he even got it back to his friends, so he had to hurry. He picked the lock on the next house and managed to find several more food items that he could at least feed his friends to starve off death for at least one more day. He snuck out and headed down to where his friends were, hoping and praying the whole way that a Holy Nation patrol didn't happen upon their passed out bodies and haul them back off to prison. And just up the road, Snooty could see a Holy Nation patrol scrapping with some raptors nearby, and he pushed himself even harder. He knew if he didn't make it there in time, he'd lose his friends and everything he worked toward. He made it to his friends, fed them the food, and slowly Silverback regained consciousness, just in time to dodge the incoming Holy Nation patrol. They only had a moment to regain their composure and take a sigh of relief because, to Snooty's dismay, his human and Czech friend could not eat raw meat. So, once they had eaten all the bread, they were back to starving.
And that's right. Even though they're starving, they will not eat raw meat. So, what you can do is you can build a campfire. Now, when you build a campfire, you're able to cook that raw meat into dried meat, and then your friends will eat it. I suggest doing this before you move on.
So they continued on through the desert, dodging patrols and eventually breaking out into the United Cities desert. They still had to worry about slavers and bounty hunters looking to take advantage of some escaped slaves, but they didn't have to worry about the extremely well-armed Holy Nation. But now they had another problem. This part of the desert was full of skimmers, massive insects that are less like roaches on Earth and more like the bugs from Starship Troopers. They didn't have the strength or the gear to take one of those things on, so they weaved their way through large groups of creatures, sneaking the entire way, hoping that none of those horrid things saw them and decided to give chase. In the distance, they saw something. A wounded skimmer and 2 dead humans. Snooty and his group looked like slaves, with them being naked and having bodies like runway models. They'd get noticed immediately, but with these clothes, they stopped looking like slaves and took on the appearance of drip lords. We now only look like a slave to like 2% of people, and that's because some people know that we're like all slaves to somebody, man. The rest of the trip was rather uneventful. We managed to make it close to a non-hostile town, but not before Silverback and Stinks began passing out every other step. And Snooty didn't have 2 arms to carry them, so once again, it was up to him to save his friends' lives. He took what little trade goods he scavenged on the way and sold it to the barman and bought as much food as he could, and hurried back to his friends who were once again laying in the sand at the mercy of the whims of the desert, and once again, Snooty came to their rescue. Soon enough, they were in beds, sleeping off their wanted status and recuperating from what was an absolutely soul-draining experience. But after something like that, there was nothing that would separate these companions. You can't go through something like that together and just walk away. Like it or not, they were stuck with one another. After the last moments of their bounty ticked away, they asked themselves what was next. Obviously a job, money, food, surviving, but Snooty had other plans. See, he thought his life was over, that once he'd lost his arm, it was only a matter of time before the guards took too much pleasure in beating him, and then they'd eventually would beat him to death. But that didn't happen, and he survived despite it all. But he had changed. He was no longer that purposeless bug that he'd been all those months ago. He had a new purpose now, to annihilate the Holy Nation. He was no longer just Snooty. He was gonna be the breaker of chains. Snooty woke up the next day feeling like a traitor. He broke the chains of so many slaves, and each one of them had hoped that they'd make it out of those pits, and yet Snooty, Silverback, and Stinks are the only ones free. None of the others made it out. They were probably still back there, digging, starving, dying. Snooty owed it to them to make them free at the very least, and he needed to do it soon or there'd be no one left to save. There were some realities to face as well. None of the group, aside from Silverback, were particularly strong. None of them had good gear, and they were still malnourished with a penny to their name. But on the hierarchy of needs, shelter and food was paramount. In order of importance, the group needed a steady supply of money to buy food, they needed armor, weapons, and most of all, Snooty needed to find a replacement for that missing arm, or he'd never live up to his full potential or jerk off right ever again. All of this stuff was extremely expensive, so Snooty had an idea. Why not put some of those skills they learned as a slave to use and mine some ore? There was a vein of this stuff just outside of town. They could fill their bags with it, gain strength as they walked back and forth from the vein of ore to the store, and they'd kill 2 cockroaches with 1 rolled up newspaper. So the group set out, and the first thing they found was a bone dog, and that dog wasn't dead yet, but if you loot it while it's unconscious and then take its meat, it'll die because, fun fact, dogs can't live without their meat. You can do this with any creature that can be butchered. In fact, it's a great way to keep skimmers from getting up once you've knocked them out. In general, the best way to start Kenshi is to walk around battlefields, hide in the distance to wait until the fight is over, and loot the spoils of glorious murder. You can make a little extra money, and you might find some great gear to upgrade your terrible gear. The other thing that you could do is lure enemies to their death. What you do is aggro an enemy, and once they start running towards you, you run to the nearest samurai patrol or gate guards and let them take care of the light work. This is called scavving, or being a scavenger, and it's a needed profession in Kenshi because all those dead bodies leave a lot of loot laying around, and the guards, those poor guys, they have to carry all those bodies to the cages. And not only do they have to be carrying an unconscious body with all its weight, but all the gear they have on them too. And we, the scavs of the world, are just doing those guards a favor by lightening their burden a little, you know? So in a way, Snooty and his crew are like public servants who aren't suffering from crippling debt and anxiety. You can make quite a bit of money in the early game doing this. And it should be said that in the early game, you want better gear, because if you have to fight a group of starving vagrants and you've got an attack skill of 10 and they got an attack score of 6, you'll beat some of their asses, but they've got lots of friends. So being able to block some of that damage with better armor and hitting for more damage with a better weapon, that can be the difference between getting knocked out in an ambush and squeaking by with a win. And like I've said before, the more fights you get into, the stronger you become. So if you're going to be fighting a lot, it makes sense to give yourself every little advantage that you can. As we're out there, minding our own business, being the lowest rung on the ladder, a group called the City's Heroes started harassing our poor Snooty because they're a bunch of racist shitheads, calling Snooty a bug, which, you know, technically he was, but they didn't need to say it out loud. And to make things worse, they even talked that shit to Stinks, calling him a boneheaded freak, and we're not having any of that nonsense. So we followed them to their hideout and just hung around, waiting for them to commit a hate crime. Once they decided that they had had enough of us hanging around and decided to give us an ass whooping, we ran and made sure that the group gave us chase. Now Snooty figured if he could get them to the gate guards, the guards would jump in and save their lives, but they did not. And instead of walking off once we got to the gates, the heroes decided to sit there and wait for us outside the gates. So Snooty had another idea. See, these so-called heroes wouldn't start a fight right in front of the guards, so we were free to walk outside, and once we got out there, hide in plain sight. See, Snooty and his crew were masters at stealth by now, tempered by the fires of slavery, where sneaking out of your cage to steal food was the only way to stave off those hunger pains. Unfortunately, the so-called heroes weren't leaving, and we couldn't knock them out in front of the guards, but if we reloaded the save, their AI will reset and they wander off to a place where we could put their racist asses in the ground without any do-gooder coming to the rescue. Now we had some great starting armor and some money to buy food, but this was horribly inefficient, and worse yet, we are still weak and unskilled at fighting, and the Holy Nation were not. So we were effectively no closer to taking down the nation and dismantling their system of slavery. We still needed money, and more than that, we needed better gear. So we got to mining, selling, and repeating. This trained our strength when our inventory was full with all the walking back and forth, and filled our pockets with many, many cats. While out mining, we see a fight in the distance, and as we've already learned, a fight in the distance means money in the distance. So we drop everything we're doing and head straight for the conflict. And as we're out there, minding our own business, we see a group of outlaws. Now, outlaws are, how should you say this, assholes, just like most of the people in this game, and they aren't terribly strong either. So we send in Silverback to knock them out one by one. 10. Each one of them we knock out is a loot pinata, and there's no ramifications for doing any of this because no one cares about the outlaws. And knocking out a person in a group is a great way to thin their numbers because not only are they down a fighter, but when the fighter gets back up, he won't have any of his gear because we have everything that he used to own. Once you have one of these guys knocked out, you can heal them, wait for them to stand up, and beat the hell out of them again. Once they're close to dead, heal them and carry them around until they're totally healed and attack them again. One knocked out outlaw is the equivalent of 2 or even more levels in melee attack and weapon skill depending on how long you use them as a training dummy. And repeat these steps until you've maxed out your experience on them.
And the best thing is, according to the Geneva Convention, this doesn't even count as torture. I'm willing to bet that in the world of Kenshi, this counts as educational. In fact, the government will actually give you money depending on who you're beating up. That's right. You could turn these guys in for the bounty on their head. It's a great way to make a lot of money real early in the game. Okay, so we have money, now what?
We have to get tougher and better at fighting, and the only way to do that is to lose and win a lot of fights. But first, you might be noticing something. You can't carry a whole lot. Sure, you're knocking out a lot of guys, but what's the point of knocking out a bunch of guys if you can't take all their stuff after doing it? We need a beast of burden, an animal slave, if you will, and there's nothing for us in this town, so we need to travel to nearby settlements to grind money and check their stock. Luckily, we find a caravan traveling to another town, and Snooty decides to follow them. See, there's strength in numbers. If the caravan gets into a fight, we benefit, because not only can we hide from the initial fighting, but we can also join in the end to help. And if a pack mule just so happens to die, we benefit greatly by looting everything that shopkeeper sells. In fact, one of the fastest ways to make money in the beginning of the game without doing any fighting is by following caravans and aggroing groups of enemies. You can lead them into the caravan and let the desert slowly destroy them until all that is left is you and a treasure trove of loot. By doing things this way, we're able to gain loot and combat experience safely without risk to ourselves. On the way to the next town, we run into a caravan of nomads selling pack bulls, so we buy one, and Snooty names her Little Muffin, because she's just so cute he just wants to eat her up. Now, a pack bull is essential for looting because she comes with a massive bag to store a lot of gear, and we'll need this for later when we get to the real money grinding strat later on. Also, cool side note, but pack bulls can eat foul meat that you get from skimmers. So you don't need to worry about feeding your animal because you'll have so much foul meat that you'll be able to lay it on the ground in a pile and swim around in it like a disgusting Scrooge McDuck. The real reason you want a pack bull instead of a Garu is these things. Now, if Little Muffin gets an attack off with these things, this thing is going to lose an arm.
That's a lot of damage.
With only 38 strength, my bull was able to do, hang on a sec, get ready, 110 damage with a single attack. Now, you're going to run into a lot of skimmers out there in the desert, and right now, Snooty is a little too weak to fight them, even one by themselves. But since we have the caravan, we don't need to worry. The most important thing you want to loot is the horns. See, these things sell for 90 cats a piece. Now, that doesn't sound like much, sure, but you get 6 of them per skimmer, which means you make a little over 500 cats per skimmer, and they only take up 2 slots in your pack bull's inventory for 5 of them, which means you could carry around potentially 50,000 cats worth of these things if you find a good place where a lot of them spawn, and you have a good way to take them out without dying. So keep this in mind for later. So
For the most part, you need to concentrate now on making money, but every now and then you'll see a starving vagrant running around by themselves, or an outlaw or a bandit, and these guys have low stats just like you. So they're good for training your initial combat skills, so take every opportunity that you can to beat on these guys. As Snooty was mining, a group of starving vagrants drew close, and while as a group they'd be a little too much for his crew, he could lure them out one by one. He could take them out slowly and gain a lot of combat experience. So what you do is you get away from a group. Click on an enemy that isn't the group leader. You can tell by their goal over here in the lower left of the screen. It'll say following the leader, and those are the guys you want to fight, especially if they're in the back row. You never want to fight someone in the front row, because everybody that sees him attack you is going to jump back and attack you as well. If you attack them from far away and only attack the enemies in the back of the group, only that enemy will notice you and they'll come running at you. And so long as you have enough distance between you and that group, you'll be able to fight them without everybody else joining in. And by attacking every weak enemy that we see, mining every vein of ore, and picking up every piece of trash off the ground, we made 12,000 cats. Enough to feed, clothe, and arm the entire group. And by arm, I mean buying Snooty a cybernetic limb. They don't have cybernetics here, so we have to buy a bunch of food and take off. But all the combat experience we gained along the way now means that we could take out small groups of vagrants without too much of an issue. And remember, when someone gets knocked down, it isn't the end of the world. That's toughness experience, and it's always worth getting knocked out, especially if your other teammates can win the fight without you. Here you can see me doing the hit and run technique. This is for when you're fighting an enemy that's stronger than you, or you're running low on health and don't want to take damage. You wait until the enemy reels back to swing, and then you run away. This should mean that the enemy misses their attack and you get a free counter attack. Back at Hang, we managed to get Snooty a replacement arm. Not as good as the original one, but at least he can wield two-handed weapons now and pick people up off the ground. At this point, the goal of the group is to get stronger, and they do that by running around the desert from town to town, ambushing groups of outlaws and vagrants, and killing the occasional manhunter that figured Snooty and his crew looked like good targets. And in destroying a group of raiders, Snooty was able to recruit another slave into his group, Jared, another hiver, fresh out of chains with no experience. Snooty felt it was his duty to train this boy to be a man, and agreed to take him with him and show Jared the way of the samurai. After a bunch of combat and many levels, Snooty and his crew got to thinking they could take out a skimmer, but before they could kill it, a lone pack of Garu took it out. A lone caravan Garu, stranded, alone, unsure of what to do. Snooty didn't see a scared animal. He saw profit, large dollar signs. They were truly ready to brave the desert in search of profit that would one day lead to Snooty returning to his former home and freeing his friends. Now, Snooty and company got so strong from just wandering the desert, attacking roving bands, and cleaning up the real trash of Kenshi that they were finally able to take out one of those long neck bastards, the beak things. Remember, the higher your opponent's level is, the more experience that you gain, and at a certain point, the only way to progress is to be fighting enemies higher level than you. So, at this point, you want to be targeting skimmers, but every now and then, it's a good idea to take on something bigger than you, so to speak. Now, I promised you a way to make a ton of money, so let's speed on ahead to that, shall we? The first thing we need to do is get to Tengu's vault, which is conveniently enough close to Hang. When I first got there, I wasn't even trying to make money. I wanted to make my way to Rebirth and free the slaves, but then this happened. Oh. Well, isn't that something? Damn it, come on. Really? I was feeling pretty bad right about now, figuring, well, this is the end, I'm gonna die here, but I looked around and found that there were guards just up this hill, and these guys were gonna save my life. Nice. We survived. Oh, that's great. And we're gonna get their they're juicy little tender bits, which is great. I had only been at this place for a minute, and already I had 6 stacks of bug horns, which was about 3,000 cats. And when I looked around, there were tons more bugs running around close by. This place was going to be perfect for grinding out these bug parts and selling. So I set up a sleeping bag just outside of Tengu's vault. See, in Kenshi, you can build nearly anywhere so long as you have the materials and you aren't close to a town. The problem is, if you set up a structure in someone else's land, you'll be taxed for it, but not if your structure is temporary, like the camping structures. You press the hammer button over here, and if you have a sleeping bag in your inventory, you can set up on this hill and grind out levels and money through skimmers. And whenever someone gets close to permanent injury, have them rest in a sleeping bag. Whenever you get in trouble, run to mommy and daddy gate guard for help. While we were grinding, we gained many levels in melee attack and defense, and soon we were able to take out groups of skimmers without even losing anyone. By the end, we had amassed a crazy stack of horns, and we were ready to sell them off, and in just a few hours, we managed to make 28,000 cats without really doing all that much, or putting ourselves in a whole lot of danger. With this, Snooty was able to get himself a better arm, better armor, and a much better weapon. But with all this practice, Snooty was proud to see that Jared was starting to hold his own in combat. We spent days at Tengu's vault massacring bugs and humans and selling their various parts for ridiculous profits, and then, as we were just about to leave and head to Rebirth, they showed up. The Holy Nation, an entire platoon of them in the open, violating the United City's borders. They were looking for us. Snooty saw red. They were here to plunder the land and take the weak as human cattle, so we set up an ambush for them by drawing them into a samurai patrol. Snooty made it his mission to whoop the Holy Nation's ass and send them back to their awful homes to live out the rest of their miserable lives as cripples. With the Holy Nation army crushed and broken laying at Snooty's feet, he realized something. The Holy Nation was only powerful because of their numbers, but Snooty knew his crew were powerful because each individual in that team was a machine, built for war, subterfuge, and knocking the f*** out. Now, having defeated the Holy Nation's patrol and getting a bunch of their loot, you may be tempted to wear their armor, but I don't recommend that for one simple reason. Kenshi has a disguise system, and it works. At least I think it works great. A lot of people don't. Here's why. Say you're a slave and you free yourself from slavery, but because you look like a slave, everyone will think you are an escaped slave, which means they'll attack you on sight if you are in a Holy Nation territory, or to get the bounty on your head. You can get around this by wearing gear associated with the faction that you're trying to hide from. With a high enough stealth, you can go virtually undetected in enemy lands. So imagine the possibilities for a solo stealth character, perhaps a guerrilla fighter, living out in the woods, dressing like the Holy Nation soldiers, infiltrating groups and taking them out, one at a time, while they sleep in their beds. Each system in this game facilitates a story, so if you're still having a hard time coming up with a goal, do this. Pick one skill in the skill sheet and make a character whose only goal is to get better at that skill. I guarantee you that you'll create an interesting story with that character with even the most mundane sounding skill. So anyway, disguises. They work the opposite way as well. If you're in the United Cities dressed like a Holy Nation paladin, chances are the guards will attack you. So you have to be careful. Work like a spy with this system. Show your UC side that a UC and your Holy Nation side that a Holy Nation, and play both factions for the fool. With an insanely thick wallet, we upgrade our gear, buy some premium food and stop eating all that dog food, and grind for in-game days, making nearly a fortune. But it was hard, tedious work. Perhaps you are like Snooty, not meant for simple, menial labor jobs. The world may need ditch diggers, but Snooty has no need for a shovel. And now that he had everything he could ever want, what more was there to do?
Now there's a saying, what do you get the man who has everything? Well, you get him something he doesn't have, of course. See, Snooty wanted his own army. He wanted a group so large and so well funded that by themselves they could eradicate the Holy Nation. But that house that he bought in Heng wasn't going to be big enough. Snooty needed to think bigger, score bigger, take bigger risks. Just like Teddy Theodore Roboticus before him, Snooty had the adventuring bug. Snooty was a little set in his ways. It happens to all of us as we get older, He tried to keep grinding out money, but it was getting harder to guarantee kills with skimmers, and sometimes he'd come close to getting wiped out completely. Stinks was always the last man standing. He was like a mentor to his teammates, someone the rest of the group could look up to being, The money was coming in too slow, and his plans for an army were at a standstill. Snooty was tired of busting his ass just so that he could be middle class. With 4 mouths to feed, it was time to step up their game. Snooty bought a home, made a research bench, and got to work. His plan? To become the best manufacturer of weapons of mass destruction around, and make money off the art of war. An automated money printing machine. But to do that, he needed money to buy materials and research books. With the proceeds they gathered killing bugs, Snooty was able to research training dummies for new recruits, a better research bench, and a smithing bench for making gear. But this hobby was extremely expensive. Snooty couldn't make iron plates in his house, nor could he farm cotton for fabric. He had to buy all of his materials, which means he wasn't making as much of a profit as he could, if any at all. He needed better smithing equipment and better grades of crafting, and to do that, he needed tons of money and super rare ancient research books and engineering plans. Snooty was going to need to plunder the ruins of ancient civilizations, and with looting such ancient places came the ever-present threat of death. First off, Kenshi's world is massive. To get from here to here can take up to an hour or two depending on how many fights you have to go through. Not to mention having to make pit stops to heal or trade.
One does not simply walk into Mordor.
You make many stops in between because that's how you survive. Now, we gotta talk about the map in this game. It's not very good for reasons that aren't obvious at first. First, let's talk about the good stuff, and there's a lot to say here. This map is highly detailed. If you zoom down, you can actually see all of the little paths through the mountains and elevation. And this is important because when you have to travel long distances through mountains, it's then that you'll be sitting there trying to recall what your drill sergeant taught you about reading elevation and landmarks. And for the first time in your adult civilian life, you'll have to use your navigation skills in a meaningful way. Well, not in real life, of course, but you know what I mean. It's a video game.
And embrace the suck.
Navigation is not a simple affair in this area, so use the map to plot a path ahead of time, and don't be surprised when that plan changes when you run into an impassable mountain. So the map does exactly what it should. It helps you navigate. You may be tempted to mod your map, and you're free to do that, but may I suggest not doing that for a while. Get used to navigating this way, and if it still annoys you, download some quality of life stuff from Steam, because quality of life is not this map's strong suit. For instance, when you add a location to your map, the first time you open your map, it is highlighted in green, which is great. But if you close out of the map and come back in, the marker's gone. Where did it go, you might ask? Well, fun fact, the map doesn't display anything that isn't a town when zoomed out. So you have to zoom way in and hope that you remembered exactly where that marker is and then plot a course. If you close the map before you actually saw the marker, or for whatever reason the marker just doesn't appear, good luck finding that ruin. If the map allows you to see all your markers no matter how zoomed out you were, this would fix a severe issue with quality of life. I'm telling you this because I want to tell you to save your treasure maps for later. If you add all of the markers to your map up front, then you have to zoom in and scan this ridiculous sized map to find that one marker you added amidst all of this land. So You want to use a treasure map. Find it on Kenshi's map, then head there immediately. That way you never miss an opportunity to loot a ruin because you misplaced a marker. Speaking of ruins, Snooty hadn't acquired any maps yet, but he couldn't ignore them because ruins were places where valuable and powerful gear could be found. But he already knew where a ruin was without needing a map. The ruins just outside of Rebirth. Now he could go there, loot the ruins, and check in on the Holy Nation to see what they're up to. They stocked their bull up with enough food for several days and set out immediately. Snooty and his crew had traveled this path many times, but off in the distance, in front of a very large group of Holy Nation soldiers, was the land they barely survived all of those weeks ago. Snooty remembered that along that path were many Holy Nation soldiers and towns, one of which blocked the most convenient path through that entire biome. Snooty decided to go up and around through the Arm of Akron and out into the Green Valley where the Holy Nation farm lived. In fact, if they played their cards right, they could exit on the other side of both towns and get spit out right in the opening of the valley where Rebirth sat. We ran up the hills and onto the small paths and cut through the mountains and came to a path that led out to the other side of town. The group descended the mountain, and when they got to the end of the path, they saw the worst thing they could possibly see: a patrol heading right for the path that they were coming down. Snooty tried to make a break for it, but someone in the group saw them sneaking out and gave chase. The group decided to fall back to a small opening in the mountains and try to hide out. Luckily, only one poor, unfortunate soul decided to give chase, and for his fellow countrymen, he got his ass beat, got his stolen, and left out in the sun to die. He was actually pretty tough to beat at this level, so I resorted to hit and run tactics, hoping we could take him down before the rest of his friends got up the mountain. Eventually, he went down from a devastating swing from Stink's sword, and once the danger had passed, we were out of the mountains and into the valley. Now that we were in the Green Valley, it was a straight shot to Rebirth, or it would have been if we didn't keep running in the patrols along the way. In fact, most of the way there, we had a patrol right behind us. Too far to see us stealthed, but too close to run away from, and too slow to put distance between us using stealth. We took a risk and climbed the hill and hid in some bushes. Soon, we had enough distance between us that we could run to the next location, and even if they gave chase, we could still run faster than they could. There was nothing that could stop us. Soon we were back home, Rebirth Canyon, an appropriate name since escaping slavery felt like being reborn as a powerful being capable of anything. Snooty felt good. He no longer feared the Holy Nation, he wanted them to fear him. So, we picked a fight with a guard who not only didn't have his uniform, but his hands were shackled. Golly, I wonder who did that? Now, this guy's stats are pretty high, which means he'd make a good practice dummy. So we kidnapped him and healed him, hit him, healed him, and hit him again. We did this until he begged for death, but we did not grant him death. We severed his leg and left him on the trail bleeding. He will live to tell this tale to his friends, who for some reason never unshackled him, and fear of the boogeyman named Snooty would spread throughout the camp. The team came to Wend Ruins, and down below, amidst all that scattered money, was a rather large group of spiders, but we ain't afraid of no spiders, and we run in and just start hacking down groups of them, but not without taking a considerable amount of damage. Since we were going to be here for a while, we set up camp and let the injured ones rest while everyone else cut down the bugs. And through their efforts, they killed the last spider just in time to save one of these old beep boopers. Curses, Snooty whispered, because this guy's dead friends had some of the most valuable gear just sitting there on their corpses, waiting to be looted. Each beep booper had a skeleton repair kit, each of which sells for 4,000 cats. These guys are worth more dead than alive, and unfortunately, this one was still alive. In the ruins, we found 2 high-quality weapons, including a big whacking stick for Silverback. We also found a ton of valuable old-world tech that will sell for a pretty penny. And inside the locked ruins, we found the most important thing of all: some maps to treasure and ancient science books, 2 of them, each of them worth 5,000 cats. But listen to me, their value goes far beyond monetary. These things are necessary to unlocking tech that will allow you to make money from all of your hard work. Passive income in the form of a material mill. With treasure maps in hand and a bag full of goodies, the team headed back to civilization. Now, we had maps, tech, material, and books, but we needed much more. Seeing the Holy Nation at their current strength made Snooty realize they needed a bigger crew, so they hired on 2 new hivers, a big dumb fella who loves farming named Bulk and a tough little fella named Littlebug. But these 2 needed gear and training, and that was going to take a lot of money, and training them would be much easier with better training dummies, so we needed material. Every bit of progress we made drained our bank account, and this mission of Snooty's was getting to be an extremely money-hungry affair. And for now, treasure hunting was where it was at, so Snooty funded another expedition. This time, Snooty had everything on the line. He was down to the last couple hundred cats in his pocket, and if this trip didn't pan out, man, he was out of luck. Was Snooty gonna find fortune in this ruin or death? The journey to get to the ruins was long and took Snooty and his crew through land they weren't used to. The thing about Kenshi is, once you start getting powerful, you forget just how dangerous the world is until you have to travel across the continent. First, you have to deal with sandstorms, and because the visibility is limited by the wind sandblasting your face and eyeballs, you can't see ambushes coming. Not to mention that when a dust storm hits you, it has a nasty habit of limiting what you can see, and you can't hit what you can't see. A dust storm will give you a huge penalty to your melee attack skill, and when you're fighting stronger enemies, a -10 to your attack could mean the difference between killing a hard enemy and getting killed by it. Then you gotta deal with acid rain, and this is just as bad as it sounds. It will slowly eat away at your limbs and various body parts until you're either crippled or dead. The effect is slow, and it's not very good at killing you, but what it is good at is making you weak enough that if you get into a fight in the middle of a rainstorm, you're probably going down pretty quick because you're pretty much melting already. And lastly, you have to worry about space lasers incinerating you and your entire crew, like using white phosphorus to cook a turkey. There will be nothing left of you. To mitigate some of these issues, armor, especially helmets, have environmental protection. Like this baller-ass hat right here. It protects you from both dust storms and acid. 50% is nothing to sneeze at, and if your character is tough enough, 50% is enough protection from acid for your passive healing to undo the damage. And going from a -10 to hit to a -5 isn't too bad either. So what I suggest is, before you take off on a long trip, make sure to buy protective gear and bring it with you to swap on and off as the situation dictates. Now, the most dangerous thing you'll encounter out there is the local wildlife and various NPC factions. For example, as we drew closer to the ruins, we entered a territory that was dominated by a local gang, as most places are, but this one had an interesting twist. See, these guys have crabs for pets. That's right, it's a guy and all his pet crabs, and the crabs hit like a truck. But the crab dudes, they got some great armor, so we scavenged some gear and Stinks got himself a neat new hat. Then the crew got to the ruins, and as they walked in, they realized the entire place was infested with robotic spiders, the most evil type of spider there is. There was too many to brute force our way in, so Snooty took off his armor, to decrease his stealth penalties, and snuck into the ruins. He looted everything he could carry, and then sneaking back out to dump it all into the bull's inventory. He did this several times until the place was pretty much picked clean. There wasn't much, just a few weapons, albeit really expensive ones, but Snooty was expecting more, much more, and that's why, after taking a considerable beating from the local wildlife, Snooty decided to go after yet another ruin they stumbled onto, risking everything in sake of profit. But the only problem was, there were two bands of rival gangs fighting it out nearby, which was a risk we shouldn't have been taking, but by utilizing our superior ninja tactics, we managed to sneak down the hill, pick the lock on the door, and hide inside without being discovered. And it was worth it. Boy, was it ever worth it. We found damn near 10, count 'em, 10 skeleton repair kits. And best of all, we found a specialist grade mercenary armor set that was one hell of an upgrade for Stinks. Not only was our dude a walking katana blender, but now he was a fortress. And to top it off, we found these rations that were, get this, worth 570 cats apiece. There were 8 of them, and a legendary weapon to boot. To Snooty's great relief, there was something worth going through all of this effort after all. When they got home, the haul was worth 70,000 cats, and that was just the stuff that they sold. There was a lot of loot that they decided to keep for future use, and some of that stuff was expensive. All in all, Snooty's adventuring phase was a very fruitful one, and after many more expeditions, one involving King Kong, we had the world by the short hairs, the best gear we could find. Well over 100,000 cats and nothing to spend it on. It was time. Snooty made a decision. The house they had been using as a base camp, it had outgrown its usefulness, and we needed something with more space. It was time to go house hunting. Snooty's mind was on the future. His army, which was still a work in progress, mind you, was gonna need some weapons. And in order to make weapons at the scale that we need a steady supply of iron sheets. And to do that, we need a settlement. Because for obvious reasons, we can't build a blast furnace in our house. I mean, you need a permit for that kind of thing. Have you seen the prices for bribes lately? It's out of control. So we need to do some prospecting, so to speak, and find a plot of land that is easily defensible in case of attack, with fertile ground and plenty of resources. Someplace where the taxman won't come to steal the sweat from our brow. Snooty decided that they would set up camp here, beachfront. See, we're nestled in this rocky area here, and the water is at our back. If we want to be trolls, we could have our town have walls where the only entrance is the beach. Meanwhile, our walls are manned by turrets, gunning down the trash in a wasteland in a hail of sharpened sticks. For now, Snooty settled for the bare minimum for protection. He was playing it fast and loose with his safety. Now, there's a couple of questions that you want to ask yourself when making a settlement in Kenshi. First question you want to ask is, what is my goal? You need to decide what it is that you're going to make, what you're going to specialize in, whether that be weapons, armor, med kits, food, or all of the above. Pick a specialization now and stick with it. By maximizing your automation framework for, say, weaponsmithing, you'll have a source of iron ore, iron plates, cotton, and fabric, and those same materials are used for a ton of buildings and armor smithing as well. A rising tide, as they say, lifts all boats. Second, you need to ask yourself honestly, am I ready for a town? You need lots of money and lots of muscle, because bad guys will be trying to break into your town and carry off all your. Make sure you're at least level 45 in weapons and ability scores before attempting to build a town. You can get away with less, but it's still pretty risky. Third, you gotta ask yourself now, how am I going to keep my prices down? You can do this by making your own materials, as I said above. Snooty needs metal and fabric, so we need to build tech that allows us to produce those materials for free. When all the materials are free, you make all of the profit. Fourth question is automation. How do I plan this? Once you have all of your tech in place, you start the process of automation, which means you set up jobs for your party members to do. And while your adventuring party is out there doing their thing, your workers are back home stockpiling food, weapons, and armor to fund your next expedition. But perhaps even more importantly, they're getting better at this skill that allows them to either be more efficient, use less materials on their craft, or do their craft faster. So it's a really good idea to focus certain characters on certain tasks. Don't just have them work on machines interchangeably. Really stick to that, because the more you specialize a character, the faster they'll get really good at it and the better stuff you'll get out of it in return. Now, before we go any further, let's talk about defenses. You have to be next to water. Why water? Because water slows you down when you walk in it. So if you were to, I don't know, say put a gate way out in the middle of the water, any enemy that comes to your town to attack will have to go through the water to get to that gate, let alone to your town. This comes with a couple of downsides. One of them is accessibility. You have to take the same route into town that your enemies do. So if you're gathering ores outside of town, this can slow things down. The benefit, however, is that you can set up turrets to attack the enemy as they are trudging through the water to get to you, all while you pelt them with arrows from your turrets. Enough water and turrets means you can defend your town with a minor host of characters. Snooty wanted to make weapons, so the first thing he needed was a research bench. And this is where most players will start having a hard time. You built this research table. Now what? I click on the damn thing and nothing happens. What am I supposed to do? There are some crafting stations that require an input to get an output, and they have an inventory. So you have to open up that inventory and put the inputs in to start the crafting process. You can't just have it in your inventory. It doesn't work that way. So for the research station, you have to hold right click until the menu pops up. Then go into the inventory. We put research books, plans, and crafting materials into it as a cost for doing research projects. Most research costs books, but some require special materials. Like, for instance, you need cotton to research cotton farming. Unintuitively, you have to put that cotton into the inventory of the table in order to begin researching. The first thing Snooty wants to research is smithing. At tech level 1, he can make basic weapon grades, but in order to make better weapon grades, Snooty is going to need a better research bench and tech level. In order to do that, he has to research tech level, and then upgrade the research bench by breaking it down and building a new one at the higher level. Each tech level upgrade gives Snooty access to crafting better grades of weapons, and to create an even better weaponsmithing station. And if you want to be as efficient as possible, you don't bother trying to set up a town until you have quite a bit of research already done. For instance, you need storage containers for each material that you're going to be making. So it's best if you research that stuff now before you actually start a town and you start getting attacked by natives or taxed by the representative of the country that you live in. If you have more research done before you move to your new town, that means you could set up defenses and get your productions moving right away instead of wasting a whole lot of time waiting for research to be done. A smithing station can go up to level 3. And each level increases the quality of the weapons that you create. This is important because while you are capable of making better weapons, you will be held back by the quality of the smithing station. So, Snooty prioritized researching better researching tools and smithing tools, and soon he was able to make better weapons that could actually turn a profit. But he was only able to make metal sticks or metal sticks with a blade on them. He needed recipes in order to make things like katanas and sabers. So he made a trip to each town in the UC and bought every weapon plan that they had on sale and learned his favorite weapon type, the Desert Saber. This weapon has no downsides and nothing but upsides, so he began making these weapons. But the problem was, he didn't have a steady supply of metal sheets yet. He didn't have a steady supply because no one was out there gathering iron ore. They didn't have anywhere to store the ore or the sheets, and didn't have the equipment needed to refine the materials. He thought it through. First, he needed the raw materials to make his ingredients, but
he needed a place to store it all. So Snooty created a special storage container for each type of material. This required research, of course, but it was worth it because without these storage containers, automation would be impossible. Here's how they work. See this container? It's for metal sheets. That's all it stores. And what happens is, if any of your crew gets a metal sheet placed in their inventory, they will stop everything they're doing, run over to the box, and plop that sucker in there without needing to be told to do it. Now, if you have iron ore, for instance, you could place that ore into the ore refinery, and if you hold right click, you could set someone to auto haul metal to it. They'll bring ore to refine and take plates out and put them into the storage container when the refinery is full. Now, if you really want to speed up automation, create a storage container for the iron ore and set someone to mine ore and auto haul it to the box. When the ore vein fills up, that character will run to the box and empty his inventory into it and head back to the vein. Meanwhile, Jared is grabbing the ore and placing it into the furnace, then using the furnace to make plates, which he then places into the storage box. Then Snooty, who is set to haul to the weaponsmithing bench, goes to the plate box and grabs his materials. But there's a problem. He needs fabric now because his recipes have become more complicated. The problem is, stores in town don't have much cotton. Sure, they have about 40 stacks, but that's only enough cotton to make 4 sheets of fabric. Not to mention, it's going to be expensive if we have to keep walking to town to buy all of our ingredients. So we buy 2 cotton and head over to the research bench, place both pieces of cotton inside it, and research how to grow cotton. Now we plant the cotton, but realize that we need water now or the plants simply won't grow. Again, we can't keep hauling to the town to refill, so Snooty built a well and a container to hold all the well water. Whoever is set to haul the water will fill the container up, and when it's full, haul the water over to the cotton bed, keeping the soil nice and wet. Setting things up this way, you can have one person doing multiple jobs, and the higher on the list that job is, the more it'll be prioritized, and since crops take time to grow, this person can be assigned multiple jobs and have very little downtime, maximizing our gains. I had one person hauling the water, tending the crops, filling the cotton storage, taking cotton to the loom to make fabric, and then filling up the fabric box, and it was surprisingly efficient. At this point, it took 5 iron plates and a fabric to make a desert saber that Snooty was able to flip for nearly 2,000 cats in profit. If everyone is doing their jobs and their AI doesn't stroke out, Snooty could be left to his own devices for several days, and when you come back, he'd have made several inventories worth of weapons that you can then sell in town the next day for massive profits. Snooty and his crew would never have another issue with money again. They were able to bring on some new employees, and everything was going great. Until one day, a raider gang showed up at their door demanding that they join their gang or die. But you know what's funny? If none of your guys are there, the raiders can't do anything to you. Because you, as I said before, are not there. Eventually, they'll tucker themselves out or run away, or they'll get trapped inside a town, and you'll have to fight them and try to get them to drop your guys. Owning property in Kenshi is fun. You get to own as much land as you want, and you can watch others work while your bank account gets fatter, just like your boss. And you get to grow and manufacture cotton products. It's like you're a plantation owner, and even though there's robots that could easily do this labor, we just, I don't know, like the human touch of forced labor. Snooty was a man of internal conflict. Legion Host, our settlement, was coming along nicely. Everything was automated with organic machines doing all the work, and with plenty of supplies being mined and refined, Snooty was free to perfect his blade making ability. We set our robot guy to make armor, and soon we had 2 expert crafters on our team, supplying what was beginning to be a rather large fighting force, scarily well equipped and ready to assault the Holy Nation slave colony. Now, when you're going into enemy territory, you have to expect that on the way, you're going to get into a lot of fights, and that can make a journey long and miserable without the right equipment. So, before you embark on any long trip, the first thing you want to do is check your food supplies. First, some numbers, and you can use the link below in the description to get a fairly accurate numbers for things that are actually pretty useful to know. You've got a cost per nutrient list and calculations for how many nutrients a character will eat per day based on the activity that they're doing. Yes, if you're working hard, you burn more calories. Anyway, Czechs are the hungriest boys as far as humanoid folks are concerned. On average, they take about 38 nutrients a day to keep happy. That's just around 3 dried meats per day. Greenlanders take 30 nutrients, Hivers take a lot less, 15 for princes, 18 for soldiers, and only 12 for workers. Skeletons, of course, don't eat, unless you're an assembly line worker, and then they eat your job. Now, all of that doesn't sound too bad, but you have animals too, and those guys eat way more than people. A bull, for instance, eats about 70 nutrients a day. Same with a goat. They are, by far, the most expensive companions to have, but they are useful. So, our team is going to need 437 nutrients a day. Our trip is probably going to take about 4 days, so we should buy 7 days worth of food just to be safe, because you will inevitably find detours in the forms of ruins on the way, and you want to be covered just in case your ADD gets the better of you. Now, you can drastically lower the price of your trip by getting plenty of foul meat to feed our bulls and our hive workers, because they'll eat that worthless meat, and since skimmers drop 8 of them per corpse, it doesn't take long to get your animals several days worth of disgusting food to eat. For my group, that's going to save me from having to buy about 2,800 nutrients just to feed the animals. The second thing you want to do is to get plenty of sleeping bags, about half as many sleeping bags as you have characters that can sleep in them. That should be enough. You need these for long trips, especially since having one character with a broken leg and 2 other carrying characters can slow your caravan to a standstill. Make sure you always bring bags. You can get them from travel stores, or you can make them with a medical bench in town. I suggest just making your own. The third thing that you want to make extra sure you've got plenty of is healing items. And I don't just mean bandages. You need splint kits as well. People often neglect these things, and they are an absolute lifesaver. Using these in the middle of a battle while your best swordsman has a broken arm can win you the fight. I've had it happen to me. Not to mention, being able to quickly patch a leg wound is key when you're stuck with slow NPCs inside enemy territory. Always remember this: the higher your athletics, the better chance you have of running away from fights that you can't handle, instead of simply getting chased down and murdered. And last, and this is optional, but you might want to consider it, you gotta bring plenty of fabric, building materials, and animal skins. You'll sometimes be trapped in a part of the map where acid rain continually beats down on you. If your guys aren't all bugmen, this is a real problem. So it's useful to be able to erect a scrap tent or fabric shelters to shield you from the rain's effects. I like to build them over sleeping bags just in case it starts raining while my characters are sleeping. Now that the boring logistical stuff is out of the way, Snooty and his crew were ready to head to their destiny. They'd either get there and easily claim victory, or they'd get there and totally eat by the guards that were still, after all this time, way stronger than they were. The journey starts with attacking skimmers for their sweet dog food level meat and their valuable claws. Traveling through the desert is easy, just point in a direction and start walking. Now, through the mountains, on the other hand, not so easy, so we need to plot our course. Remember to zoom in on the map to look for the small paths that lead you through the difficult to traverse areas. While you're walking, you may run into a large host of Holy Nation soldiers. These guys are pushovers, and our group can easily kill them, believe it or not. The paladin might give you a little bit of trouble, but the rest of them can't hope to compete. compete, and if you pick them off by sneak attacking or by attacking the back line, you can whittle them down to nothing. And it's worth doing, because your soldiers will get a ton of EXP for that. But then there are the smaller groups, and you might be tempted to attack these guys since there's not as many of them, but I don't recommend it. So, Snooty and his crew pull up on the front gate of Rebirth. The front gate is the worst possible angle to attack from because there are 2 gates, each of which are fully staffed, and the AI here is programmed to go to the turrets on the wall if you get seen coming near, so a frontal assault would be suicide. But if we swing around to the back, it's a lot easier because, to my shock, I realized that everything in Rebirth was just as I left it. All the guards at the back gate had no gear and no weapons, so our team of highly trained killers were able to wipe the floor with them fairly easily. Once we got to the courtyard, it was shocking. The guards were gone. Everything was completely silent because every guard that used to work in this area had been knocked out, stripped, and thrown in a cage. And because there were no guards to let them out, they've been sitting in their cages without food or water for over 100 days. And because the cages always kept them from starving to death, they spent that 100 days in intense hunger pains and crippling boredom, effectively immortal, but in absolute agony. Silverback had created a special little hell for these guys, a hell that not even death would allow them to escape. Given everything that had happened between Snooty and the Holy Nation, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Snooty didn't feel anything for them, but he actually felt pretty bad. Sure, they made him a slave, sure they beat him, sure they were racist and said mean things to him, but no one deserves this kind of torture, so he decided that he was better than these people. He was going to free them, along with the other slaves. Now, even though he was setting these people free from their stupidity and torture, they still attacked him. He was starving to death, naked, and most of all, outnumbered and outgunned. And he hated Snooty so much that he was willing to get knocked out and thrown back in his cell just to get a chance of hitting Snooty just one more time. People like that, you can't let have freedom. They're too stupid to enjoy it anyway. Now, Snooty freed all the slaves he could find and gave them a choice. Freedom out there in the wasteland with no help, food, or shelter, or join me and have everything you could want and all the holy sentinels you can kill. Very few took up our offer. Now it was time to kill the rest of these slaving bastards, and one by one, gate by gate, we cleared them out. Even cut a few limbs off before stuffing them into a cell, just so they never forget who did it to them. Snooty went back through the camp to clean up any survivors of the initial attack, and to ferret out any cowards hiding from the fight, and because Snooty didn't want to leave the slaves behind, because the Holy Nation would eventually send new guards and the cycle of slavery would continue, Snooty had done a little bit of everything there is to do in the world of Kenshi, and when no other goals were left standing, he destroyed his longtime enemy and wreaked terrible vengeance on every single sentinel there, and granted freedom to anyone that desired it. But there were still Holy Nation thugs out there, whole cities of them in fact, and perhaps it was time that Snooty and his soldiers did something about it. If you like this video, leave me a like. If I get 4,000 likes, I'll do another video on Kenshi soon, and we'll cover all of the late game stuff that you can do. Now sub if you want to see more videos like this, and hit up the Patreon if you'd like to support the channel and your boy Paulie personally. And this has been a rant from Strat-Edgy, and now that you heard it, go play some Kenshi, because that's what I'm gonna do.